I just wanted to make sure that, because Raine's going to share about Francis Brabazon. And
Only she can. She's had so much time.
and
Wow.
the beautiful thing is that he had a point blank range on Baba. He was right. So you get from Francis how it was to how Baba liked you to be when you were around him at such close proximity. So I'll listen in as long as I can, but I have a couple of people that are not going to be um, happy if I'm up this late, still talking. So anyway, so Rainey,
Jeff, you've
and
put me on
you
the
want
spot. You've put me
you
on the
want it
spot
open to
here.
questions as well.
Yes, well, you were going to interview me. I mean, you've put me on the spot here.
Yeah. Well, can you give just a little history of his life, even to begin with? Um, because I think it's very interesting. And I remember asking Bao Churi, did you have any inclination when you were growing up that you would one day be one of the intimate mandali of the avatar of God himself? And he said no, he had no idea. And and didn't even really believe in God. And here he is. He winds up spending almost his entire life with him. So I'm just curious what Francis was like in growing up.
If everyone could mute, please. There's some sort of papers rustling or something. I know it's
Was Jeff.
with that one. Jeff, stop rustling papers. It's
Probably knocked the microphone, that's all.
an impossible medium. No, Francis would never have told us how to do anything where Mayor Baba was concerned. Francis behaved how Francis behaved, and didn't expect for a minute us to behave as he behaved. A fairly unassuming person in that sense. In fact, he consciously did not like to influence people and enjoyed other people's personalities because his personality was rather introverted, except when he was being crusty and funny and everything else. But I suppose really what we did round him was just watch and and see how to fit in. See, we were on his property. I mean, that's what we thought in the beginning. We didn't know all these things. But no, he would have had no clue whatsoever as a little boy growing up in London with a father dedicated to a utopian future through the eyes and writings of William Morris and the socialist movement. They came to Australia to lead the ideal life, to live on the land and a free land, new land, to go into the utopian future of the idealistic, artistic movement that was all around people like William Morris. His father, Percy Brabazon, was quite moved by the fact that at some meeting he actually got to shake the hand of William Morris in England. They came to Australia when he was a little boy, 7 or 8, I think, and from London. And they went to Melbourne, one of the 2 huge cities in Australia on the East Coast. How's the sound, Jeff? Is it okay?
Yeah, fine.
On the East Coast, and they moved to a tiny town where Percy had bought land, which Francis called the Rabbit and Stone Farm. It was nothing like the advertisement, and it couldn't grow anything, and it was in a snappy little town, and without a lot in the town, and I mean, they just struggled to eat, struggled to get enough water, struggled. struggled with the local school, but fortunately with a sophisticated father like he had, who was what we'd call a journalist today, or a movie critic or a play critic. He wrote articles. And a mother who was also, I gather, fairly well educated and played piano. And the piano came with them, or they bought another one in Melbourne. I don't know. There was a piano in the house. And so the three children, Francis, his brother, and baby sister, who passed away at age 7, I believe, Eileen, lived there with a lot of stress and a lot of difficulty in this small town, trying to eke out enough food to eat and pay bills and all sorts of other difficult things. Eventually educated, but sort of, when people would ask Francis about, well, what school will I send my children to? And, with the hippies around, my friends with children wanted to know what to do about education, how to make their education as idealistic as us hippies had hoped in the very idealistic movement of the alternative people that mostly were around Baba, what to do. And Francis once said, all education really that matters is in the home. So just send them to school. They're just going to learn their times tables, as Jeff and I often talk about learning times tables, and they're going to learn to spell and whatever, but really everything they're going to need in life, they learn in the home. That he said to a friend of mine, and it always stuck in my mind. So the family struggled along, songs from the mother, playing the piano, Percy, I suppose, trying to add on to their education in the little local school. And eventually he went to Melbourne. And if you read the first section of Ross's book, it's a fairly good biography. A lot of Ross's book was his actual thesis for his PhD. And so the rest of the book, you get into a lot of criticism and things you have to do for such a book. But the first quarter of the book is about Francis's young life in Australia. Still romantically and poetically said, but a lot of the details are in that book. But anyway, his father rented a secondhand bookstore. I'm not sure if that store was already established as a secondhand bookstore, but I do know a lot, having been raised in the same state, in the same huge city, Melbourne, a very intellectual sort of city, a cold a lot of the year, prides itself on a higher standard of education when I was growing up. And so I'm not sure really how Percy Brabazon got this bookstore, but he did. And eventually Francis left the school, I think in his young to mid-teens, went to the city and read every book, it said, in the secondhand bookstore. And that area where his bookstore was, I must say, in the 50s and 60s, the hippest area imaginable. It was called Little Flinders Lane, and it was right near the central railway stations. The Bohemian movement had their art galleries there, so that Percy was there and Francis was there in its formative years. I would say a lot of his beliefs, his growing away from an ordinary family, would have been set up in those years. And he ended up with several best friends, but one of them, of course, was John Bruford, who was a sculptor, an artist and inventor, Bernard Bruford's father. And they were among a crowd of what we would call bohemians now, but earlier than our 50s bohemians. And they were painters. Francis, he read all the books in his father's, I gather, rather enormous secondhand bookstore, but he also would borrow books from other stores overnight, wrap them in brown paper so they wouldn't be damaged, then take them back to the bookstore the next day as if they hadn't been missing. He was an artist's model to survive when he was a painter. He was a respected artist by people who in Australia we were raised knowing their names. And there's a couple of documents I have where there's gallery shows and Francis Brabazon's name is on it with some of his paintings to be shown. I do know a great story about they also moved into one of the lanes. So the lanes in old cities were like New York. You'd have the main street, but the lane had to be behind for all the things to be loaded into the shops or in through the pavement into the basement and so on. So the lanes in Melbourne became the hip sort of cheaper place to be. And so Francis and John and some other friends rented an apartment upstairs in one of the lanes as well when they went out on their own. And I do know there's a fantastic story of them buying a secondhand piano and that being pulled with levies and everything that John Bruford had invented to get that piano up to the floor it was supposed to be on and in through the window and in, because there were big push-up windows down to the ground, you know, like Victorian windows are. Mummy's busy right now. Thank you, darling. Put it in a bowl for Mummy for later. That's very thoughtful. Thank you, darling. Thank you, love. Thank you, Franny. Jay Baba. So they moved into this place and the piano moved in through the window. And I gather their life was fairly extraordinary. I mean, Francis saw Pavlova at the theatre. He had a way of sneaking in the back door of all sorts of things, bookstores, theatres. That experience moved him tremendously, seeing great artists in the arts, the fine arts, piano players. He spoke of an early piano player that came, but I remember him talking about seeing singers from abroad. And so they immersed themselves in the extreme and perimeter visual arts, but also snuck in to get a grasp of the classical arts, which apparently John Bruford knew quite a lot about. So he always seemed to have someone around him who he could compare notes with and read different books and find out all sorts of things. I mean, to have finished Plato as a teen and so on, he had a natural knack to learn, to listen, to absorb. And so those years were very formative. And at one point, he saw and he went to a lot of talks, and in the lanes there are arcades, beautiful Victorian arcades in Melbourne. They're still there, joining all the lanes to the main streets. And off those arcades were all these rooms. I remember them when I first started working in the city, of the something or other secret society or the something or other, what you could go to these unusual talks. I, for example, went to a talk by a Munshi who followed Ramana Maharshi off a lane, off an arcade, in a room in this unusual, futuristic, informative area in the city where Francis lived. And eventually he saw an advertisement for a talk on Sufism, incredibly well read at this point. And I'm really briefing this story. As I say, you can read Ross's book for these early years. And that talk was by a man called, you know how it is, you just completely blank out when you're talking of something you've known for 60 years. Baron von Frankenberg. And Baron von Frankenberg, when he gave this talk on Inayat Khan, this is nothing to do with the Baba world of Sufism reoriented. This is Inayat Khan's Sufism. And so he went to a talk in Melbourne, and as soon as the talk was over, he apparently went up to the Baron and asked, are you looking for staff on your property? Do you need someone to work for you? I'm really glossing over the early years there of the question you asked. And he said that, no, I'm not looking for I don't need any help. I have a wife and I don't need any help. And anyway, they got talking and everything. And eventually, apparently, a letter came or something happened, and Francis was invited to his property. And the Baron had to apparently work his way around his wife over this situation. And that's really more of what it was about than rejecting Francis's offer, was how to get this into the house and have this person to study with and this interesting man to study with. And so Francis did indeed move to New South Wales to his property as the houseboy, the worker on the property. And these two gentlemen went through the really difficult books then and analysed absolutely everything one can imagine. So I think somewhere in there, with all the reading and with the atmosphere he was in, and the first set of poems he wrote that were published, The Proletarian's Transition, is him moving away from all the utopian idealism into seeing that this belongs or is part of a whole huge world for me. This is a different world altogether. This is spirituality. Nothing to do with spiritualism. Nothing really to do even with intellectuality. This is spirituality. And he and the Baron, I believe, read and analysed absolutely everything they possibly could. And suddenly the Baron received from America a set of books called The Discourses. Or maybe it was one book back then, I'm not sure. And that is what led up to the answer to your question, Jeff.
Yeah, it was, I think, the 5 copies, the 5 set. But keep going. This is very fascinating.
I've left out heaps of stuff. As I say, probably at this point I am into areas of what Ross calls spiritual training. I think Francis would not have liked a phrase like that at all. But anyway, it was in Camden, New South Wales that the Baron lived. And so this is about we're up to about 1943. So Francis was born in 07. You can say they were in Australia from 1914, 15, growing up, then back to Melbourne. And by the time he goes to the Sufi meeting and the Inayat Khan meeting with the Baron von Frankenberg, we're up to 1942, 43. So one interesting thing about the Sufi society in Melbourne, and also interests me that Barbara in 56 went to Sydney and Melbourne. There was no Avatar's Abode in 56. Is that on the Camberwell station, there used to be a poster in a glass case, as they'd have on stations in those days, that they'd unlock the case and change the poster and it was indeed for Sufism, Inayat Khan's Sufism, with blue and gold. And as a kid, I just used to, there wasn't very much interesting on that station. You had to change trains at that station. I would stare at that beautiful blue and gold poster with, I suppose now, Persian calligraphy. I didn't know anything about such things. So this is a well-established society in Camberwell. Now, when Barber came in 56, he stayed in Camberwell. To me, that sort of, it feels significant. But anyway, so he goes to the Baron's place in Camden and found out that the Baron had a title. His name was Sheikh Momin, M-O-M-I-N, Sheikh Momin, in the Inayat Khan order. And he then had a Murshida named Rabia Martin, who lived in America, who would communicate with the Baron on what was going on in Inayat Khan's order. There is a wonderful film about all of this history on Tony Foley's blog that Michael LePage did, and went to France and to the family of Inayat Khan. And yes, it's on Anthony Foley's blog, Telly. And so with that story, but that's an aside, but that's a way to see that aspect of that particular link in the end to Baba through Rabia Martin. And so they tried meditation. In addition to meditation, they discussed Hazrat Inayat Khan and spiritual masters, different religious traditions. And more importantly, he also instructed and encouraged Francis with poetry, because Francis had come to the decision that... Hi, Yasmin, could you mute? Thank you. And so Francis discovered that he found poetry the most satisfying. And so he encouraged Sheikh Momin Baron von Frankenberg, encouraged Francis with his poetry. He once passed Francis onto his love for Homer and his understanding of the spiritual significance of Homer's epics. He also gave Francis his first real appreciation of Sufi poetry, particularly that of Fakhruddin Atta Jalaluddin Rumi, Sadi, Shamsuddin, and Hafez. And so for his teaching text, Sheikh Momin had privately published a collection of 38 papers entitled Social Gatakas of Pir o Murshid Inayat Khan. And they studied all of these things in this little house in Camden, New South Wales, in the country. So there was Francis from the country in the city, amongst all the sophistication, then going back into art, back to his poetry, also the piano. So he decided that he should study piano. Once the piano was there, that he and John Bruford had put in the apartment in Melbourne, in the Lanes. And he did quite well with piano. I gather from the childhood with his mother, I don't know. But at one point, he got to a point, having watched a master pianist come from abroad, that Francis had short, stocky fingers, and he could see he would never master it. He would never get to where the hand needed to go to be able to master the pieces that would be next. He mentioned this to Sam at one point. And so he stopped the piano as well, learning the piano, and went to his poetry, and then met the Baron, and then now we're back in Camden, and wrote early poetry. And at some point, Rabia Martin mentioned to Sheikh Momin that she had come across a book, these books, the discourses, and that she actually was convinced that Meher Baba was the master to follow after Inayat Khan for that order. So the Baron wasn't very well at that time. And so he, just 1 minute. Bill? Bill? Bill?
Hey, Kelly, if she's gone a while, would you feel like singing I Dwell in Dust and Sing? It's a beautiful ghazal by Francis Brabazon.
Sorry.
Yeah, I've got Telly on hand to sing I Dwell in Dust and Sing whenever you need him.
All right, wonderful. So let's get out of Australia for a moment and then go to Telly. So the Baron decided that what really should happen here is that he should find out firsthand from Rabia Martin and friends who this person was and whatever. And he knew the only person who was as practical financially as himself was his friend Francis Brabazon. And he bought him a ticket and sent him to California to find out about Meher Baba. And so he went and was greeted here by the various people and moved to Fairfax, California. So this was a huge shift for somebody who had never left Australia before. And Sheikh Momin kept close correspondence with Murshida Martin in America. And, you know, she was a Murshida of the Inayat Khan order. And the Baron was a sheikh. And so when Francis arrived, it was decided that he should be trained to be something in the order as well. And that she then decided that he should really work closely with Sam Lewis, who had a title in that order as well. So Sam Lewis, of course, was a poet himself, and a very good one. And they got on pretty well. In those days, Don Stevens would come in and out of that group. There was a beautiful girl whose mother had been very close friends with Rabia Martin, Shireen. She was part of that order, and they were very studious. They lived on site in Fairfax in the compound of that group, and they studied and did everything they were supposed to do, except Francis didn't feel he had enough to do. So she said, what you can do is you can build a path between the main house and the big barn-like building structure where we have all our meetings and where there's lodging and so on. So that was one way for him to use up all his energy.
You know, let me mention is that Sam Lewis was met Baba back in the 30s, and he also lived on the center for about a year, and he later became known as Sufi Sam and started the you know, the dervish dancing in California. And
It wasn't dervish dancing, no such
or,
thing.
or whatever
It was folk dancing. It's actually the dance that we do, the dance for peace these days. That
Yeah.
entire movement started from Sam, with them doing dance to Chinese music, Japanese music, Italian music, music from all over the world in this simple hall in Fairfax. They would even put on costumes to respect the culture that they were doing the dance for or to the music for. That movement from, and of course, Sam in the Inayat Khan movement is still their respected Murshid in their lineage.
Yeah.
And in that stream of...
That was the dance of universal peace.
That's right.
Yeah,
So Sam really invented the dance of universal peace with Francis right there with him when it was being developed.
Beautiful.
In a hall in Fairfax. Sebastian Baker has tracked down that group, and that group still dances in Fairfax. But they didn't know about Sam or way back. They still do dances of other cultures. And so sure enough, Francis writes to the Baron to say, this is some serious business. This is a perfect master. This person she's discovered is the real thing. So the reason that we're poring over the discourses is for every good reason. And so he stayed there for approximately 18 months. Shireen died, and that caused the group in a plane crash. She was a pilot. And that caused the group a lot of depth. There's a very beautiful interview with Don Stevens about the day that that happened and the type of bonding in that group due to Shireen's death. And Francis had been, going by the poetry of that time, very much in love with Shireen. And so that phase kind of completely turned Francis around, and there we have a living master, the last thing he would have ever thought of. Rabia Martin was starting to get very, very sick. She had throat cancer. he came back to Australia only to find that the Baron was really, really sick, and he too had throat cancer. And I suppose because the poetry developed on a much different scale there, once around Sam, Lewis, and Francis, it might be a good moment for Tally to sing Guzzle 83, I Dwell in Dust and Sing.
Beautiful words to this very profound meaning.
I dwell in dust and sing, and my song is most sweet. For although I lie prostrate, I do not entreat. I would not wish to be less than the seasons which wait their turn, nor than fire hidden in wood to burst into life and burn. My beloved spins the earth on the tip of one finger. Why should I cry for gifts? He will not forget his singer. They who ask God to fulfill their desires have no faith in him. For the essence of faith is to abide the beloved's whim. I hold out my cup for him to fill at his pleasure. Now or at world's end, it will be the same full measure. Waiting is easy for me. I spent 1,000,000 years as stone, then millions more, shaping my ears to receive song's golden tone. Now my waiting is praising, and my praising is sweet. For although I lie prostrate, I do not entreat.
Beautiful, Tally. Thank you. To a David Hogan melody. Very nice. So Francis went back to Australia. The Baron passed away, and Francis was left some money and a lot of books. He was left money to buy a property for the movement. And that's the money he used to buy the Beacon Hill property called Maher House now. It's 20 kilometers north of Sydney. But the troubles that started when he came back between the Inayat Khan Sufis, and now he does not want to be the sheikh, split the group pretty much in two. And those that stayed, we still know to this day. That was around 1948. Sheikh Francis was now 41. A new murid who met him for the first time said, "An attractive, active, muscular man, positive and animated. He has considerable Irish charm and whimsy, and a sense of humour that could be a delight to the intellect, as well as provide a good belly laugh." And he gave addresses as the Sheikh in various things. But in the end, Meher Baba said, he is pleased to note that in spite of obscure and unclear problems confronting you concerning Meher Baba and his working, and you have been directing Sufis in Australia, let's now contact Baba directly. Baba will see to sending me or any of his disciples to Australia and USA at the proper time. But in the meantime, I would welcome all and every query personally, and I will guide you. This, of course, then led to Francis going to New York on a hunch that Meher Baba might be going there, and for 6 months staying until he came, immersing himself in the arts once again. And eventually Baba did come to New York, and Francis met him.
You know, Rainey, he worked for Fred Winterfeld,
That's right.
but Fred told me he was always found him down in the boiler room writing poetry. He was not a good employee. He was down there writing poetry and when he was supposed to be doing work, you know.
Yeah.
But I think Baba had sent him, you know, Fred was to take care of him,
That's right. He
you
was to
know.
take care of him, and Francis didn't like hunches, but he went there on a hunch. It was one of his first doing something on a hunch, and it paid off after 6 months. But he also was supposed to be, you know, the night person, not the day person in these apartments. And so that meant that he could go off in the daytime to matinees. He saw some of the great ballet dancers, orchestras, musicians, art song singers, his education in the fine arts and art song and all sorts of concerts and plays, particularly plays, was enormous. And those years helped that situation. And then, of course, they went down to South Carolina, and Francis Baba called several meetings with Moshe Deuce and Francis about what to do about Sufism, and that those that had come through in Ayat Khan, and what to do about that. And that Ivy Deuce wanted to go on with Sufism Reoriented. And Baba said that the only way that anyone could be a murshid was to be rid of 3 hindrances, to be rid of hindrances and have these 3 things in place: truth, temptation of money, power, lust, and so on, be rid of them, have no vagueness, and have no dishonesty. And when those 3 things are mastered, one is a murshid or a murshidah. And Francis said, well, then I'm not. So Baba said, just go back and have readings and have meetings, and I will guide you. He gave him a date to get back, which was a matter of weeks from Myrtle Beach. So he decided to go down to the coast to New Orleans and catch a merchant marine ship from there to Australia. And he would be back before the set date that Baba said to go back by. And he started his meetings and his readings, and people fell away. And though some stayed with him, and they studied Baba's books, and Baba started communicating more and more with him. By, I think, 54 or 55, there were 2 cheeky lasses in Melbourne. Ina Lemon was one of them. And Ina had somehow seen in the paper that you could buy now and pay later. This was a very foreign concept to Australians, buy now, pay later. So she and her friend bought tickets to India and went to India. And whilst there, she actually invited Meher Baba to come to Australia. Upon her return, telling her meeting leader this fact, Francis nearly had a heart attack that she had invited Baba to Australia. And so he had purchased the land, and he decided the only way with the sort of money he had to build a place was to apprentice himself to a stonemason, hack the stones out of the cliff of the property into these huge blocks, and build the house himself. There's footage of the stonemason on Michael LePage YouTube channel where you can see Francis cutting the blocks and building the house to try to have it ready for when Meher Baba came in August 1956. In the footage, you can see how incredibly physically strong he became. I mean, I gather he had a very muscular, good physique because he was an artist's model back when, and then he was in the army. So he had to be healthy enough to be in the army, but he went in as, I think, a pacifist anyway. He mostly peeled potatoes in the army, he said. He became very adept at peeling potatoes. But to do the work that he's doing, when you watch the stonemason film and see the physique of him and the fitness by 1954, it's amazing. And so Meher House was built by hand, and Meher Baba did indeed come there after America in August 1956. And of course, Francis went back and forth to India after that quite a lot, you know, for unusual meetings. One of the Indian men's meetings, the trip over to the west coast of India where Baba gave talks. You can see pictures of Francis boiling hot in brief clothing and palm trees and so on. So he actually was back and forth to India for several trips in that 56 through 58 phase. And then Baba said he was coming again. And that was after the American accident, but before the Indian accident. But we see Erich at the airport in Brisbane with a cane and so on, I think from the injuries of the former accident. And they came to Australia in June, winter, and it was pouring with rain. And the effort and the huge thing to get a 100-acre property together. There's a wonderful story. Francis was driving from Sydney up to Brisbane, up to Queensland, thinking it was warmer, to look for a property. And along the way, he stopped with now a famous poet, a friend of his, Judith Wright, on the Gold Coast, which is south of the capital of Queensland. Very beautiful area too, with rainforests and hills and things. And Judith Wright said to him, you know, really this area is becoming very populated. Why don't you look north of Brisbane? There are some beautiful areas there and more practical financially. And that's what he did. He drove 100 miles north of the capital, Brisbane, in Queensland, in this subtropical area. And he was camping, as I remember. Some things I remember are different to this book. He was camping at the side of the road, cooking his billy, cooking his tea, and a farmer came by and asked, was he all right? And he told him what he was looking for. And he said, oh, there's a pineapple farm for sale here. You'd be able to see it. And that's how he first saw the 100 acres that became Avatar's Abode, which he purchased. And then the scramble for, I think, 8 months to try and get the property together. He actually, the room that's Baba's room is built from the hardest wood called tully. And it's contained. It's a room that's contained, but what to do with it, when he couldn't afford the time or the money for a big structure, he bought it. I think it's called a sheep shearing barn kit. So that which is Barbara's house in Australia is still that huge sheep shearing barn, which is like a tea cozy over Barbara's room, which is exquisite in this amazing wood that has this beautiful smell. That's Barbara's room at Avatar's Abode, where he stayed for 4 days. On the way, when he came from into Brisbane, he stayed in a little hotel called the Bellevue, which became very controversial and was pulled down illegally in the middle of the night. And everything with Barbara and buildings, they seem to disappear and they're controversial. And then they went up to Avatar's Abode and stayed. And as you know from John Grant's book, it was intense. Barbara's stay there and the type of talks were unlike anywhere else. And the community were just regular working class Australians mostly. So for Barbara to be that intense with all of those talks was pretty remarkable. And then at one point he asked for entertainment. No one knew any entertainment. And I believe they sang a song and did a couple of things. And then he asked them to say the prayers. No one knew the prayers. So someone had to run down to the Rouse's house. The Rouses and the Bruford both ended up living on the property. And they got a copy of the prayers and read the prayers. And so in a way, I'm not sure whether it's just us supposing, but the theme at Avatar's Abode was always to entertain the beloved. And I felt that that's what Francis thought Barbara wanted there. And of course, then they started their anniversaries of Barbara's visit every June, which is what we call a Sahavas here. And but Francis himself, as a person, one would never ever know that this person had this absolutely giant, enormous intellect, because it was intellect off the syllabus. It wasn't the program type of intellect we're used to having with school, this year, this that year, this the other, Homer comes in there, Plato comes. It wasn't like that at all. And so the man himself was quite contained and quite ordinary, and one did not feel inhibited around him. How are we going here, Jeff? Any more questions?
Well, here's what this beautiful, really. Can you describe your meeting with him and kind of how you found his personality to be? Any little anecdotes? He's just come back from being 10 years with Baba, and he comes back to Avatar's Abode, and you're meeting him, and a whole group of young people kind of gathered around him. And of course, when I was there in Avatar's Abode, you can see the focus on the arts, entertainment. I mean, it's very much more than. It's quite obvious that art and all the different arts are really one of the major focuses, rather than devotion in any kind of spiritual sense. I'll tell you one thing though is when I went over there, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, the moment Francis used to say Baba's name inwardly. He was a great proponent of saying Baba's name with each breath. And when I came on the property, Baba's name started inside of me, and I could not stop it. It went on, and I couldn't even. I was there for 12 days, and I was only getting about 3 hours sleep a night. And Baba's name was just going on and on and on. He packed that place with Baba's name. I could not stop it. even to try to get to sleep. So there was a lot of stuff he was doing at other unseen levels, I'm sure. But go ahead. So what was it like to meet him, and any of the kind of personality quirks and traits that kind of fill in the flesh him out, you might say?
So we had lived in Melbourne, my boyfriend and myself, and we had come across Meher Baba through Adrian Rawlins, a rather extreme, unusual Melbourne poet who was writing to Meher Baba, and Meher Baba was writing back to him. Supposedly, it's like Meher writing to us, but Meher is writing the letters. So Baba was writing back to him. So he felt quite solid in Baba, but he was a very, very unusual, very exotic individual. And but he gave us the discourses. And he would talk about Baba, and he would talk about the letters. I don't know what happened to those letters, but apparently they do have some of them. But Baba would have Francis write the letters because it was to an Australian, but he'd tell him an outline of what to put in the letters. So we kind of had to get away from Melbourne for a number of reasons. And I had been very famous there in the rock world, and Stephen had been a journalist in the Rock and Roll Go Set magazine and light shows, and we ran the Dylan film and the Monterey Pop film. We'd had a whole quite well-known life there, and we just up and left, much to my parents' horror, and we moved 1,000 miles north to the area of the Sunshine Coast. We had no idea there was an Avatar's Abode or a Francis Brabazon, or it had anything to do with Meher Baba. We did not know this. And I'm not sure at that point Adrian might have known about it. He knew about Meher House, but I don't know if he knew all the details about Avatar's Abode. We had only been there, I think Francis came back in, I think July or August of 69 and lived in Sydney for a short time. And then he went up to Avatar's Abode. And so we moved to Noosa Heads, not far from Avatar's Abode on the Sunshine Coast, I think in about October of that same year. So we had to work out how to earn a living. So I got a job as a waitress and sewing for people. And Stephen got a job. I had been a gemologist. I had had a day job, a night job. I mean, I'd had a whole career in Melbourne. I was a valuer of really valuable gems. And here we were, sort of beach people, not dropouts really in that sense, but definitely we felt like that. And so Stephen decided he should go on writing for Go Set, and he'd write about these incredible hippies and all these people in these beach communities and surf communities, and go on running the films in the surf theaters and Don't Look Back and Monterey Pop. And so now he wrote to Go Set, and they said, what you should do is an interview of all the people that have started these marijuana farms. Now, we had read, for years, the Whole Earth catalogues. We were not dumb about any of these things. We could build a geodesic dome if we needed to. We knew how to survive. And so he went to all these houses, and the last house he went to, he goes in the door, and there is a very big picture of Meher Baba in the house. And he says to this guy, Sim, his name was, oh, my old lady's really into that guy. She reads him all the time. And he said, oh, how amazing. One of his disciples has just come back from living in India for 11 years, and he's in a property up the road here, and they're going to have a reading this week. Would you like to come? It was just like that. It was that simple. So Stephen comes home and tells me this, and I'm terrified. He's going to know that Stephen's Hungarian, Yugoslav, Australian, and brainy, and he's read everything, and there's nothing he doesn't know about in the Whole Earth catalogue, and I don't know anything spiritual, and this is going to be so embarrassing, And I also imagined he was 6'2", tall and thin, and with a head that had all the knowledge in it, So I sort of did as much thinking about it, and I might have even rung Adrian, I don't know, but I knew a little bit before I got there. Well, when we got there, the meetings were readings. Francis never really gave talks. he said, Tally has a great line where Francis said, no, there's no use me talking and you interviewing me. Everything that I've got to say is with my pen, is through my hand. So we go along, and it's at the Shipways farm, which they had meetings in like 3 different houses, one of them on Abode. And then the 4th meeting was called a monthly meeting. And that was entertainment. That was a much bigger thing like we're more used to in the barber world, like in the theatre at Myrtle Beach. And so we met him. Now, my father was a textile expert, as was my grandfather, and he was immaculate. He was a textile expert in menswear, men's suits, men's hats, men's ties. He designed men's ties and things. So when we walked in, and we'd been invited, I mean, he'd been informed that we were going to come. So when we walked in, I saw this man, this really nicely dressed man with a little tweed woolen sports coat on and a little woolen tie tied nicely. And beside everyone else, I thought, wow, he's so well dressed in the country. And I thought of it as the country. I'm really a city girl. And and we met all these people. Now, I have to tell you about these people, the Shipways and the other people there. I really had never met such old-fashioned people ever before. And as sort of hip people, and we thought we were, I had to sort of go back to my grandmother's era to even try and decide what to talk to them about. Anyway, finally, someone said, you need to meet Francis Brabazon. And it was this man who had, I felt, dressed nicely to meet the 2 new young people from Melbourne, the journalist and the gemologist. And he was not, I wouldn't say formal with Stephen, but he was very mannered with Stephen, who was 6 foot, very handsome, mountains of black wavy hair, very, very, very good looking man. And then he got to me and he said, you look like a good Irish girl. I bet you make a really good cup of tea. On hindsight, when I think about that, it was just making me feel comfortable. He could feel I was so nervous, you know. And I said, I mean, I really can. I can really like real tea. And he said, yes, then you can be the chaiwala. I said, oh, thank you so much. But of course, I had no idea. I'd have to look that up the next day, what a chaiwala was. So I thanked him profusely. So we sat in a circle, and here were these, what appeared to be country people, very nice, humble people, reading Stay with God and every paragraph 3 times. Quite seriously, comprehending something I couldn't possibly understand a word of. And when it came my turn, I read beautifully and everything. And the next person read the next paragraph, and I realized they understood it and I hadn't. This older man. So that was our first interaction with Francis at the Shipways house. And then we were told there was a meeting the following week in the home of John and Joan Bruford on Avatar's Abode. But in the meantime, Francis had asked us to drop by. We lived about 30 miles away, but in those days in the country, you know, and we jumped in our old Volkswagen and we went down there on a Wednesday night, and I had prepared food. And that became actually a bit of a tradition that we would go there on the Wednesday nights, and Francis and Stephen would just go on about all the futuristic things that had been happening in Australia. Stephen was very futuristic, as you know, from his films and his Mundally Moment films. He was always onto something with that beautiful camera that he did all those films with. And so the meeting at the Brufords, the only thing I remember was he asked me, was I warm enough? And I said, yes, I feel okay. And he said to Stephen, does she have a jacket? And Stephen said, oh, do you have a jacket? And I said, well, we got rid of everything to come up here. We just came up here in a little Volkswagen. So these are the things we have left, thinking that we had dropped out and we were humble and we didn't have anything anymore, right? And he said, yes, you definitely need to buy a jacket. It can get quite cool up here on this mountain in the night. That I remember. Now, that reading that night was more of a meeting and people talking. But someone said to Francis, can we discuss the reading as we go? And Francis said, no, just buy all the books in the back and then you'll understand what you're reading. The back of Stay with God. So Stephen goes off to Brisbane and comes back with this pile of books from the American bookstore and all the bookstores of the Vedas and the this. And, you know, that book is so complicated, every line. You really need the 10-part course with Ward to do it. And so that stuck in my mind, that he didn't really talk about it at all. The next meeting we went to was a monthly meeting, and that was lovely. That was on Abode's Abode itself. Francis lived behind a curtain on what looked like risers or tables, and in the big barn, the tea cozy barn over Barbara's house. And we got to go into Barbara's room, and that's when it hit me like a bomb. It's just that it was just so, I'd say it was strict in a sense. You could feel not strict, you could feel a depth and a meaningfulness you had not experienced before. And then, to my amazement, he touched a photo on the outside, went in, bowed down to this pair of sandals and put his head on them, then stood up and walked out backwards. So we thought, well, we better do what the host is doing, you know, because we'd gone early to this monthly meeting, and we did the same thing. And because I'd forgotten to reach up and touch the thing he had touched on the way in, I saw there was a photo on the way out, and I touched it on the way out. There's one on each side of the wall as you're going to Barbara's room. And he looked at me with this loving look that maybe this this fancy pants from the city is attentive. she notices things. And then I watched the program. It was people doing music. From that particular night, it was someone playing a guitar and someone else playing an electric keyboard and doing music to a song from The Quest. And that's when I realized, oh my God, he's written plays, not just this book. I only knew about one book, Stay with God. And so it just evolved to us being there. And also then at one point he said, you know, that's a really long drive on that old road up to Noosa and back. I think you should stay on the weekends. The bunkhouse over here, we didn't know what the bunkhouse was. It was just another little building, and it had bunk beds in one section and a door with a little room in another. And in the middle of it was this sort of triangle, and it was all covered in wood. It was stained wood. It was nice, but I never even thought what was in there. In fact, I thought there must be a rock in there or something. I hadn't thought of anything was in there. I stayed there for 11 years. Over the weekends, I never thought about what was behind that strange section next to the accommodation rooms, one usually used for a family with a child and the other for 4 women or so. It turns out that that's where Barbara spoke, and that was a concrete slab with beautiful stones in front of it, and that's now been restored, and a picture of Barbara is sitting there as if he's talking to you. But we slept there for years. We had no clue. I mean, we had no clue about anything. It's like we had no idea of Francis's background. We had no, there wasn't the web where you just look things up. But I did notice that when the curtains were back from where he slept, the library was astonishing in the back of that room. It was amazing. And I also noticed that the LPs went from one side of that shearing barn to the other. Long play albums. It turned out they were of world music. And sometimes in those monthly meetings, he would play a piece, sometimes even a piece of Bach with sheet music, and we were to follow it. And we, over the years, went through all that music and were introduced to all this unusual, amazing music that he was aware of, and accompanists, and the type of humility that goes into the world of music, and people he admired in that world. The experience of being around him when people would come at the Abode was, I'd like to be invisible. He had a knack of merging with crowds, and if someone didn't know who he
Looks
was,
like we've lost her. Oh, there. Rainey, we lost you for a bit.
oh really? Did my web go out?
Yeah, it went out, but just there at the end.
So I
know,
think that Francis was invisible in a sense. I mean, we knew who he was, but if people would come that didn't know who he was, they wouldn't have a clue who he was. Just as I, when I first went into that room, didn't realize that's who it would be. But never, ever would he behave like a great author, or he had been a mandali around Maya Baba for 11 years daily, by the minute, by the second. We never heard anything like that. The 3 talks, if we could get a copy of anything. And that's why when I first went there, I started writing things down, because there was no way to find all these things out otherwise. And eventually a room was built onto the Abode, and there was a kitchen and his room. But in these days, there wasn't anything like that. And we stay in the bunkhouse, now called the meeting hall. The bathroom was you had to bury the bathroom on Sunday nights when you left. But the shower part of it was a rock and a tap and a bucket and a cup, just like India. So we felt that, I suppose by the time we got to India, it was completely familiar, because it's how we'd been at the Abode around him. But he never spoke of Baba. He never spoke of his experiences. He never, he just wrote. But he would come out and, I mean, extraordinary things like this foolscap piece of paper. He would get Lorna or May to type up these whole programs of every single person that's in the play, everything about the play. This one's, I think, 1973. These reams of paper all typed up of the entire plan, an incredibly huge artistic mind, and fair. And the Sydney people are into this play, and the Sydney people should have Saturday night for the anniversary, and we have the Friday night, so they've got a day to rest. I think you're going in and out, Jeff. I think actually we might be fine.
Oh,
Yeah. So that was the other aspect of it, was the people that lived on Abbott's Abode that helped Francis. The Bruford family, Joanne, and the Rouses particularly, Robert Rouse and Lorna Rouse. And of course, Francis had lived with them when he was writing Stay With God, with all the cables going back and forth and all the editing happening through Lorna and so on. So for the first Amartithi, we watched the plan develop. We watched the preparation made for people important in Francis's history would be coming up, like the LePage family and so on, and to just cook and sort of stay back and observe. We both seem to have the knack of staying back and observing. Francis himself, though, featured all these other people and these things he would organize for people to be featured, but he didn't give a talk, and you kind of had to ask him a question to get an answer. I got better at that. You're muted, Jeff.
we had to do the same thing with Darwin. Darwin Shaw would have been content just with his companionship with Baba, just right there, you know, just being. But we learned, well, if he's got a lot of stuff there in the cellar. We need to kind of see if we can draw it out. So we asked him all manner of questions, and then he was stuck. He had to he had to answer our questions somehow, and you know we learned a lot of things about the inner life. Otherwise, it would have been lost. You know, I mean, he would have taken it with him, and but thank God, a whole lot of us we just kind of probed him, and but sounds like Francis was a little harder to probe, but Francis at least wrote it out there, you know. So, but Darwin wasn't writing any, you know, much in the way of poetry or anything until that last book that he started writing when he was in his 90s, Effort and Grace, you know.
Yes, someone once asked Francis about Darwin because he was in India with Darwin. I think he re-met him in 1982. And Francis just laughed and said, "Don't be ridiculous. What could I tell you about a man like Darwin? Nothing I could tell you about Darwin. Darwin's just pure love. There's nothing I can tell you about Darwin."
Yeah, they were both very unassuming,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Yes, Diane.
What's that? Oh, yeah.
Did not Darwin, did Francis ever give you any information about who he was to why he got so on the inner circle of Baba, and if he ever knew who he was in Baba's incarnations previously?
No, Francis was absolutely dead against anything to do with psychism, anything to do with former lives. And when Phyllis came there, he said, "Don't go on with any of that psychic stuff here. We've nicely avoided that all of these years." And Phyllis said, "Well, thank God for that. It's a nuisance." So no, he never, ever, ever talked about previous lives, ever.
But did he ever have an understanding of why he became so close to Baba in this lifetime?
I suppose I could presume, which is presumptuous, but I think that just the studiousness of him, and Baba obviously needed as this avatar, something we don't have actually record of as avatars. There must have been munchies and scribes and poets, but this time round, he wanted it stated. He wanted the person on site doing nothing else but write, and gradually them Francis being invited to these various things for long periods, the Indian meeting, the men's meeting, and so on. After 1958, just weeks after, he was invited to come to India and give everything up. I do have a letter from that period where Baba talks to Francis and says, "Are you ready to give everything to me?" And Francis said yes. And he said, "Everything." And Francis said yes. And then he turned around and said, "I have three Francises. I have Francis of Xavier, Francis of Assisi, and Francis of Australia."
Beautiful.
And and of course, that's all we ever saw was someone from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. writing. After tea and a smoke, from 10:30 a.m. to 12:30 or 1, writing. We would just see his back. Sometimes he'd turn around and go like this and want another tea. And then the evening meal. On the Saturday night, he would actually hang out with us, and especially if he brought up a series of songs. This is all before 72, before Sam came and formed the choir. Then that was the play group and the choir. Though the play group the players had existed before that. We did The Quest, we did The Moon, we did a lot of the plays that he had written before we got to 73 and the dominant thing for a couple of years of being is Dying by Loving. But he expressed himself and his beliefs in his work. It was all in there, you know, and that we are all equal. I'm just a chum of yours. We're all chumps here. You know, we're all just trying to work out. And he also appreciated the second chance. Like, he was a Mandali and he did all that, but he also appreciated being one of us. He really liked to be one of us and go on pilgrimage. At some point, Rano came to try to talk him into coming back to India. And he said, no, I feel the work that Baba wants done is being done here with this group around me.
Beautiful. Betty
Betty?
has a question there.
It sounds like he felt responsible for you, but he didn't act like we'll say a Murshid. And I wondered if you could talk like, was it example? Was that how you learned from him? Would you say? How did you learn from him?
He was never a Murshid.
Yeah.
And he never behaved like one. He behaved like the man that ran this property. And there was a lot of property work to be done. We're talking about 100 acres in a scorching hot place that had to be serviced and fire. He knew all about everything to do with the country property. You know, the fire, gullies to stop fire, how to run it, how to service it, how to maintain it. One of our community was a builder, Rod, and he did a lot of work upgrading and maintaining it. And that was a big job. And then planning the meetings, the readings, and which he'd be part of. But essentially, you know, on an average weekend, we were just busy cooking for 12 to 15 people, or them working on the property, or practicing plays, or singings in the end after 72 singings, constant singings, and so on. And but I think he felt that this somewhat progressive group around him was the direction for the work that Baba had written with such difficulty through him. That's how he put it. Baba said, I have written well through you, but Francis felt that with a lot of difficulty, he had written through Francis. Hi, Josh.
Hey, yes, I just had a quick question, and if it's not relevant, skip over it, whatever. I was just wondering if you knew much about Francis's relationship to socialism, you know, and whether he talked much about his sort of like socialism. Because I mean, I read some situations of Baba saying, "Oh, don't do socialism," but then also I've heard that Francis was a socialist, and I don't mean, obviously I don't know. Obviously, it's all chaos in the wind. But I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about that, if you knew, and if you don't, that's all right.
Well, there's a great piece in Being is Dying by Loving where Francis talks about equality a lot. He talks about why does everyone have a lawnmower in each house? Why isn't there a lawnmower at the end of the street and everybody has a day where they use the lawnmower? It's not socialism like we think of it. If you look back to those idealistic times of utopian thinking, it is, what can I say? Anyway, proletarian's transition actually took him out of politics altogether. He didn't think politically in any way. But as a man, he behaved in the most fair manner and promoting youth and driving youth to study and to be part of his errors. Avoiding his errors was definitely part of the way in which we gathered what to do and what not to do. And he was a man of few words. You know, he very quickly could say, that doesn't feel like a good direction, or something like that. Or someone would come to him and say, how will I educate my kids? Kids are educated at home. We've just had another child. How do I stop having children? Why ask me? I'm a single man. He never got involved in our personal lives at all, but definitely his father, Percy, had been a part of the William Morris movement for equality. And we definitely saw that book right away and read News for Nowhere as quick as we possibly could to try and keep up. So a very fair person who felt that all people were equal, and that there's a funny joke. Now, this is a joke, okay? Don't go carrying this away like a bright red commie flag. But there were two, they'd read the paper every day at Maribad, and there was the left and right wing in there with those Mandali, and they were squabbling away. And Francis, Baba leaned over to Francis and he said, I'm not political in any way, but sometimes I think if I was, I'd probably have to be a socialist like you. Now, Francis was not he didn't vote. He managed to fall off the registry. Voting's mandatory in Australia. So I worked out how to fall off the registry too, and I didn't vote either.
We got
See some hands up there.
Fred Stankus.
Hi, Raine. Reading Stay with God just overwhelms me, coming from a physical plane conscious person. Beethoven was supposedly deaf and composed music, and sometimes from the subtle sphere. I almost think Francis had such ability and genius that it must be coming from another place to correlate so much history and put it together so magnificently. Reading Stay with God, it just intoxicates me. And I was wondering if you felt that perhaps he had a taste of the subtle world, if not in the subtle consciousness itself.
Francis would loathe that question. I have no idea. I'm just an ordinary girl from Ashburton. I have no idea. I mean, definitely, I would say that if you read The Making of a Book or The Water Carrier, a lot of The Making of a Book by Robert Rouse is in The Water Carrier. He was moved to something. All of his knowledge flooded at the same time. All of his knowledge flooded in. If you hear Ward in this latest talk for the anniversary, he spends the whole talk in the Kailash few couplets and in another few couplets. It's a study. And he had put it off, he was asked to write it, but he had sort of put it off and put it off and put it off. And then suddenly he had to write it. It had to be finished. And so I think that when you write and you compose, there are places that you are taken to that are not you. They're sort of the sum total of all that you know. And of course, that, as we know, can't just be one life. This is totally me. This has nothing to do with Francis, who never mentioned another life. Although I once cheekily mentioned another life to him and got into trouble for it. So, and Baba had said he wanted Stay with God written, and it's the second most important book to God Speaks, and that hurry up, get it finished, and so on. And Baba himself wrote 3 discourses that aren't anywhere else, that are in Stay with God, in the beginning, in the middle, and the end. A very important book. But Francis himself, being the medium, had no knowledge that he showed us of being the medium, other than, of course, being an incredibly amazing literary man. Amazing literary man.
Rainey, I heard, and I'm pretty sure it's true. Bob said about Stay with God. Here, Francis has written a 6-plane book, and he's only on the gross plane. Did you hear that?
Yes, or 5th plane, as Josh heard, or on the planes, as I heard, or
Yeah. But somehow he was a medium. It kind of got written through him, even not necessarily from him, but through him.
I'll tell you a hint here about Francis. He did not like that type of thought. He liked the type of thought, or as Josh says here, through a gross plane writer, he liked the type of thought that you turned out to be the genius this life. Who cares about the other life? Who cares? That child must have been Beethoven in her last life to play piano like that. To him, that's undermining that child's genius. You don't go there. This child's genius. She's playing Beethoven like that. Not this child's a genius because she was Beethoven in her last life, or she played Beethoven in her last life. It's this life, this now. This
Just
that
now.
you're doing now is everything. And so he did not like psychic talk. He did not like phenomena. He did not like, once I said to him, oh, we went through lots of various phases. We went through I don't know if anyone has read the songs of Francis Brabazon that I was moved to write on avatarmaababa.org. And it's the sort of thing I look back now and I read and I think, God, how did I remember all that? And Sam said, how did you remember all that? I'm glad you did it because I forgot half it. The types of things we studied around this man and the phases. So one phase was the troubadours. Now, if ever I could identify myself or even something of myself or something in Francis, it was about the troubadours. And we'd hear quips, of course. I'm not saying he didn't say anything. Oh, we heard lots of quips, lots of stories, lots of things. And you can all read my book when I'm dead, because that's when it'll come out, because there's too many quips in it. But anyway, he would make a quip about the troubadours. You know, those troubadours, they'd come all the way down from France and from the Queen's court, and they'd come down to the Silk Road and they'd pick up Lover Beloved songs. They'd take them back to the French court and they'd make them into personal love songs and get tenured for the winter. And so a lot of those songs of the 14th century by the troubadours are actually Sufi Lover Beloved songs.
Wow.
Do you know that there were even nuns on the Silk Road learning that? So he would come out with these things, And there was a sect who sang Sufi Lover Beloved songs. I think heads were chopped off in the end, but he would come out with lots and lots of these things. Fortunately, a lot of them I would write down in the bottom of the 8 songbooks with the date, with the thing, all that's there. Because we all tend to confabulate and make things up. It's just our romantic natures. But in the troubadour phase, I went full bore into it. I read everything. I read all the Njal sagas in Stay with God and decided who was Njal and who was this one in the Icelandic sagas. And then I read all the troubadour stuff and the Grail and the Green Knights, everything. And then I got on to reading books about the troubadours themselves, the poets themselves. And then he had all the records. Then we learned all the records of these glorious tunes and melodies. And a lot of them we borrowed for I'm Truth, I Am Love and other songs. Anyway, I said to Francis, I think I know who you were if you were a troubadour. And he looked at me like, don't you dare. It's like, but I couldn't resist, smarty pants. She couldn't resist, because by then I'd also broken up with Stephen and I had a day job in gemology. I had all these books. I had money again and everything, I was fancy pants again. And I was the one that would bring nice cookies up from Brisbane too, from the Shingle Inn. And so I said, I think you were Benant de Ventadorn. And he swung on his heel and walked away from me. He said, that's too clever, madam.
Hey, well, let's have Telly, and then maybe we should bring it to a close, but
yes,
I have Telly, but then read something of, if there's something of Francis's that you feel like reading at the end. This has been fantastic, Raine. It's just,
thank you.
Just so kind of spontaneous and free-flowing. It's beautiful. And here on the East Coast, it's getting
You're
late.
getting tired, yes. What is it, Tally? Tell us a story.
Oh, no, I was just wondering if Francis ever talked about the Aboriginal population in Australia and their use of song lines and their instrumentation like the didgeridoo, and how that is tied into Earth's story.
I did not ever hear him mention them. And frankly, I never heard of them either. I went to school in Melbourne and I knew there had been Aboriginals and we learnt about them from books in schools. I never met one or saw one in Melbourne in my life. When I went to Queensland, I saw Aboriginals, but I had a time wondering, I wonder if that's an Aboriginal or an Italian or whatever, I didn't know anything much other than what I'd learned in school about Aboriginals. I did know that we had done to them much like the Native Americans or any conquered country, really, for an Indigenous people. I did know that. But Francis had a sort of a rule, like with politics, of not involving himself in something he had not studied. So he did not go into their work or their music or their place. And I don't know if he, I'm sure there is one book he gave me on Aboriginals. He knew about it, but they were not part of our community. So I don't remember anything being said. And no, I don't know anything about their music other than trying to do circular breathing and trying the didgeridoo, which I failed. I do remember someone coming with a didgeridoo and playing with Bob Welsh. And Francis was very moved by this, incredibly moved by this instrument being played in Baba's house. And also a man came with a bagpipe. He was the father of one of us lasses in the choir, and he played Pierbrock. He played the real thing. And Francis had him walk back and forth and play the bagpipes to Baba. I mean, there was not a dry eye in the house. Francis's background, of course, is Irish. And if you look at Carolan's harp songs, the blind famous harpist, he does have indeed a planxty, two planxties to Brabazon, Lord Brabazon. I don't know if that dates back to Francis's name and family. Planxties were a payment piece of music for accommodation for a month and plenty of wine and food. And we did feature a couple of the Brabazon pieces in the 100th birthday of Francis. But I think mostly what he did with us was induce through action, not through reading like with the Baron, through action, the history of the arts. Like he said to me, you better go and learn to, I told him I'd been a ballroom dancer. He asked me what my past was and how I had such good rhythm when I sang Eileen the first time. And I said, I was a ballroom dancer from age 6 to 16. He said, well, there's absolutely no room for that in the Baba world. So you have a lovely voice, so you might as well go and learn to sing. So we found teachers and I learned to sing. And eventually I ended up over a very long period as an adult with a licentiate in voice, guitar, and musicianship and the history of music. But he also was a traditionalist in the thought that everything is based on something else. So you could borrow a tune. Whose tune is it? You could borrow Danny Boy. It was written in the 14th century really anyway. Danny Boy was just war song words badly given to it in one of the wars. We can make new Baba words and reorient that tune because there's only 7 notes. All these tunes are all based on some other tune. And he felt like that about a lot of things in that traditional sense. But then when the modernists came along, like John Parry or Bob Welsh, he was totally open to it because he'd been very modern himself. And who a friend of mine said, in this world, though, where it's not actual representation, you have to be very honest and very careful. And it was an education like a university could wilt for, frankly. It was, when I look back on it, and it was quite astonishing. I'd just like to do a short reading of something that was just underneath the other page, so that will do. The plays actually gave you a sense of life. You know, I mean, in a play we did Other Than Being Is Dying by Loving, which if you buy that CD and listen to that CD, it gives you an idea of the man, that which he wanted, bookends about this particular thought, this particular way of thinking. Francis's way of thinking is Baba's making it new. And anything too sentimental, he would definitely steer himself away from, and that ended up being some paper or play, and that steered us away from it, and too much reflection. And he wrote a very modern play called Squares. I think it had a different name at some point, but it was called Squares. And in it, he had things like vegetarianism versus non-vegetarianism. And the famous line in the end, vegetarianism, non-vegetarianism, whoever speaks of either is aught but a fool. And there was another play about Fool and Fooleen who lived in the suburbs and gave up absolutely everything to the children and didn't develop themselves. Don't forget about yourself. I mean, these things are in these works. Go by my hand, Tally. Don't interview me with my words. Read what I have written. Narrator. Meher Baba often used the ocean as a symbol of divine being and likened us, people, to drops of that ocean. We are very ocean itself, but we are only conscious of ourselves as drops. The why and wherefore of this is a long, long story, and would bore beloved Baba if I were to attempt to recount it. Francis saw how easily Baba could get bored with what was and what had been, I do believe. And it would bore beloved Baba if I were to attempt to recount it. But sufficient here to say, the ocean became a drop, but remained ocean. The huge became tiny, but remained huge. The boundless became bounded and remained boundless. And because of the love of the ocean for each of its separated drops, periodically the ocean becomes a drop while still retaining its oceanity. Because of the love of the ocean for each of its separated drops, periodically the ocean becomes a drop while still retaining its oceanity. This divine drop is the avatar who suffers the limitations of each drop while at the same time reminding it that it is reality and it is the ocean. And guess what? God set a rainbow in the sky as a sign that no drops ever will be abandoned, but will eventually return to the ocean and become the ocean.
Jai Baba. Thank you, Rainey. That was really lovely. Really lovely. And I'm sure it got recorded, and I think it's just a great testament to one of Baba's mandali seen from from a very personal vantage point. It's beautiful. Yep.
We in Australia, due to Francis, we don't separate our young ones and old ones. In fact, the young ones even let me, one of the olds, into their tent sometimes because I sing, I guess. But when we have our harvest, we have it together. And sometimes 4 generations are together at the anniversary harvest. And so, you know, when I glance up and look at Josh, there's a part of me in Josh, because as a community, no matter all the dreadful strife, and it's just as dreadful at Maribad and just as dreadful at Myrtle Beach and just as dreadful anywhere, because that's just how he loves to have us suffer, particularly around each other. It's a marriage, the sign for marriage. But I can look at Josh, and when I read something like that, there's something of me in Josh. There's something of our history in Josh. And so to study Francis's works, when I came to America, he said, don't let my work die. This is the important thing. You have no idea how Baba suffered to get that work out of me. Don't let it die.
Beautiful. Wow. Let's have a few moments of silence. Jai Baba. Wow.
Jai Baba.
Thank
When my
Baba.
disabled girl was
Got me
born,
out of my vacation. I'm on vacation, but
when my disabled girl was born, I actually rang Francis. He didn't like ringing overseas. It cost a lot of money, but I rang him because I felt I had to explain the situation. You know, it was just so difficult to explain. And the next, within 3 days, I had a telegram. Joyful feelings felt all around. The Franey baby is Baba bound.
beautiful. No, wonderful. Well, great to see all of you. There isn't going to be anything on Tuesday, and I think just keep what I don't know when I'll be done. I'll be done with my vacation on the 15th, and then I'll come back in, and we'll see. I think it might be nice to have a meeting on taking Baba's name, you know, and how that works into your life, and what the Mandalay have said about it, and what Baba has said. Might be a very interesting topic. And for many people, it's a lifeline to Baba. When you're standing in line at the grocery store and you got nothing else to do, you have Baba's name. Anyway, much love to all of you. Marion, great to see you back and running.
Thank you. Thank you.
Not jogging yet, but you know,
Soon.
yeah. Jai Baba. Much
Baba.
love. Bye-bye.
Hey, Baba.
See you, Michael. Yeah.
Jai Baba.
Thanks,
Hey,
Raine.
Baba.
That was beautiful.
Baba.
Yeah.
Jai
Baba.
Baba.
Thank you, Rainey. That was wonderful.
Thank
Oh,
you,
my
Rainey.
pleasure. I just thought if you wanted to go on with a bit more study about it, I did write 3 articles. One is The Songs of Francis Brabazon by Raine Eastman-Gannett, The Funeral of Francis Brabazon by Raine Eastman-Gannett, and The Paintings of Francis Brabazon by Raine Eastman-Gannett. They're all on avatarmayababa.org, but they just come up if you put that in. They've been read so often.
Good.
Thank
Thank you.
Jeff, have a
Thank
wonderful
you.
vacation
you.
wherever you are.
you. Jai Baba.
Go
Where
where
are
that
you,
book,
Jeff?
go where that book will get to you soon. I mean,
Thank you, Jeff.
it's going to be held up by 4th of July.
Oh, sure. Thank you again so much for thinking
Yeah.
about that. And thank you, Rainey. That was just beautiful. I enjoyed it so much. And I learned so much.
Yeah.
Relax, Jeff, and enjoy yourself.
Okay.
No
Yeah.
meeting
I
on
will.
Jai Baba.
Hey, Baba
Hey,
Nasreen.
Baba.
Oh, Jai Baba.
Avatar Maya Baba Ki Jai. Oh,
Jai
there's
Baba Ki
Michael.
Jai.
Michael's a great poet. So we are fortunate that all the poetry goes on and we still get to do the arts, and Baba's making it new.
Mhm.
Oh, thank you, Rainey. Coming from you, that's a compliment. High
Mhm.
praise indeed.
Beautiful, all of you.
Jai Baba.
Thanks,
Jai
Raine,
Baba.
once
Hey,
again.
Baba, everybody.
Jai Baba.
Jai Baba.
Hi, Marion.
Oh, hi, 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 hi. Oh.